The shameful treatment of U.S. veterans, a history of broken promises and exploitation. Millions have suffered to ensure we are free. But is it possible that thousands of these have been shamelessly discarded throughout our history in the name of convenience, expediency, and greed? I've been trying hard not to go on social media very much lately, but the other day I decided to scroll through TikTok. I was just going to watch one or two videos, and I ended up watching more than one or two, but it was because I'd come across something about a historical event called the Bonus Army March on Washington, D.C. I'd never heard of this before. Have you? If you don't already know the story, you may not believe what happened next. Comments are welcome. The Bonus Army of 1932 is a forgotten piece of American history that symbolizes the corruption of our time. We sowed a harvest then. We are still reaping today. I couldn't imagine when I first saw this that our government would do such a thing, especially in the 1930s. I actually recoiled in disbelief. I thought perhaps this was a deep fake, but at the same time, it is almost 100% consistent with the shameful behavior of the American government during my lifetime. The iconic image of Uncle Sam, so determined and strong, telling our young, impressionable men of the early 20th century, so full of hope and progress and belief in the future, we were going to fight a war to end all wars. We failed. Will we ever learn? The promise. The United States entered the war, as we had a tendency to do until the 1950s, completely unprepared. Our first century and a half, the United States, for the most part, believed that standing armies were engines of oppression. Unless an official declaration of war was declared, an army served no purpose but to oppress the citizenry. This is a belief we were bequeathed from the founding fathers who, admittedly, have fallen into disfavor in our more enlightened age. The war was the most horrible man-made calamity in history up to that point, and frankly, has only been surpassed in the time since by the Second World War. Census.gov states there were 116,708 American fatalities. Those who went to the war were paid on average $1.25 per day. The men of the time who stayed home in America to work in the factories or on the farms, they were making an average of 10 times as much. So not only were the soldiers putting their lives on the line and suffering dreadfully in the trenches, but they were shamefully underpaid. But the cost. I know Oklahoma never recovered from World War II. I wonder now if we ever really recovered from the First World War. In order to right this wrong, at least a little, Congress passed a law issuing an award to the veterans, kind of a sort of promissory note, in 1924. This would be worth anywhere from $600 to $1,000, worth very roughly $17,000 in 2013. All's well that ends well, right? Sadly, while the law was initially received with gratitude by the troops, it turned out that the promise was mostly empty wind. The notes matured in 1945, meaning you would get it in 21 years. Your family could benefit from it if you died, but to many, it seemed like they had been robbed. The odds were very high that few would ever receive this bonus. They felt for a short time that they could stand content like the good, obedient soldiers that they had been. This protester is living in a coffin-sized area to remind us that money benefits the living. The dead don't need it. Times were hard on everyone, but for these soldiers who had already lost as much as 2 years of wages to serve their country, they felt like they had been betrayed. The government was doling out millions to save the banks and the big industries from the Depression. Sound familiar to anybody? But they would somehow allow the soldiers to work their own survival out till 1945. At that time, life expectancy was 54, meaning that quite a large number of these men would not survive to earn that benefit. In those hard times, that prospect looked more and more bleak all the time. These men had already beaten the odds by surviving the war. But how many times can you roll the dice at the crap tables before you lose? The bonus army. Some would ask, well, why didn't you just save some money for the future when times were good? But to the victims of bank failure, this was not sound advice. They had followed that advice and felt as though they had been swindled out of their money. From 1929 till today, a lot of people have felt like they played by the rules, but the rules are no longer written by or for the people. Walter W. Waters was a sergeant in World War I, and he followed the news, hoping that Congress would do right by the soldiers. He agonized when Hoover vetoed the bill approving the bonuses. According to ThoughtCo.com, on May 15, 1924, President Calvin Coolidge had in fact vetoed the bill, providing for the bonuses, stating, "Patriotism bought and paid for is not patriotism." Congress, however, overrode his veto a few days later. NPS.gov shares that if the movement had an official beginning, it would have been in Portland, Oregon. 400 veterans had gathered there by May 17, 1932, under the leadership of a fellow veteran, Walter M. Waters. They began a long trek to Washington aboard a freight train, loaned to them for free by the rail authorities. After exiting the train in Iowa on May 18, they hitched rides and walked the rest of the way to Washington. Smaller splinter groups reached the capital on their own. By June 1st, some 1,500 men, some with their families, were in Washington. And Britannica.com shares, in an effort to force early lump sum payment of these urgently needed benefits, the Bonus Army, sometimes called the Bonus Expeditionary Force, converged on the nation's capital in the spring of 1932. They moved into abandoned shacks below the capital and set up shanties and tents along the Anacostia River. Despite inadequate housing, sanitation, and food, the movement's leader, Walter W. Waters, managed to maintain order and to oust agitators. And here we have a Hooverville shanty of the Bonus Expeditionary Force in Campton, Washington, D.C., June 17, 1932. How did the story end? Stay tuned for more tired blogging and find out.